Hello, welcome to How to Sew with Laura. I am your guide to all things design. So today we are going to continue working on our skirt, and as you recall last time we put in an invisible zipper, and is that just gorgeous or what? I love how they are so truly invisible and they just do a great job. Now I used a black one. I could have used a white one on here, but I kind of liked having the little black thingy sticking out instead of a little white thingy. It's, you know, personal preference. So what we're going to do today is we're going to stitch up the two side seams. And they're done a little bit differently because one has a zipper in it, and we need to finesse where the zipper ends. And so there's a little bit of a trick to that. Invisible zippers are beautiful, but they're not easy. And then the other seam is just going to be a normal seam, and we'll show you that. And I'm going to show you how we finish the seams, because these are not French seams, so they're not automatically finished. And what I use to finish them is something called Hug Snug seam binding, and I will show you how to apply that. So let's get right to work. So when you do a invisible zipper, as if you recall from the last video, it sort of stops short of the actual stopper, because the particular foot that you use to put it on can't go any closer. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do is finesse this seam. So I'm starting now, this time I'm starting from the zipper to see if I can match up, and that's much better. But you really have to hold your pieces and not get your finger in the way. And all I'm doing is lining it back up with that little bit of seam that that I made before. So it's not perfect, but let's see how it looks from the other side. And if I don't like it, I will take it out and realign it, or I will do some hand stitching to connect the two. So you see what happens is I got a little bubble. So this is not good. So I'm going to have to take that out and try it again, which is not fun. But you'll learn from doing these kinds of things. Also, depending on the kind of fabric that you use, some fabrics are so much more forgiving and so much easier to line up with an invisible zipper, and other ones are not. So I guess what I should do is a tutorial that uses a regular zippers for those of you who don't want to have to deal with this and who aren't as enamored of the look of the invisible zipper. So what I'm doing right now is I'm pulling out my stitches carefully so that I don't shred my fabric. And this is not a delicate fabric, it's a cotton, but because it has a particular weave, it's not easy to work with, and you really want to be careful and not overwork it, which of course I probably just did. But let's see what we could do. So I use my fingers as much as I possibly can when I'm doing work like this, better than a tool. So I'm trying, when I use my seam ripper, so here you get two lessons in one: how to use a seam ripper as well as how to sew on the zipper. So you just try to very gently pull some of your stitches out with the point of the seam ripper, and then the rest of it you do it by hand, and you just pull your threads away, because if you do too much heavy work with your seam ripper, you are absolutely bound to hurt your fabric, and you really don't want to do that. So you see, I just basically loosened up, and I work either side. I go back and forth, and if there's one little guy left, I find it, I just loosen it up, I pull it out, I find out where the ends of my thing are. Okay, so what ended up happening, so I still have the rest of my seam that I had started, and my original intent was to match that seam up with the end of my zipper seam. and because this was so bulky, it went a little bit off. So I'm going to give it one more try, and I'm going to try to get as close as possible, but we shall see what we shall see. Okay, so I am looking for my seam here. I'm going to start about 1/2 inch down on the same seam, so I'm going to stitch over that part of the seam, and I'm going to go up to, I'm not going to go next to, but I'm going to go up to the bottom part of the zipper. And that's where I'm going to stop, because I've got a delicate fabric. Then I'm going to go back, give myself a little back stitch. So I left a little bit of a gap here. I'm going to finish that gap with needle and thread. It's about 1/4 inch. Let's see if you can see it better on this side. So I stopped here because this is where I felt the zipper itself pushing my zipper foot away. So I stopped here, and I'm going to do this little bit by hand because this fabric can hold it. Now, just to show you what it looks like over here. So we had that bubble before. It's not pressed, of course, but we don't have the bubble anymore. Okay, and all we'll have is, and I don't want to open it up too much, but right about in here is where that little bit of a gap is. And that's the part that I'm going to stitch by hand. And I'll show you that right now because that's pretty easy to do. So basically all I'm going to do is, again, on top of my existing seam, my regular seam, I'm just going to take my needle. I did a little hand knot at the end of the needle, and that's fine. And I am holding my zipper and my seam, and I'm going to do an overstitch, which basically means that you do a little teeny stitch, but then when you start it, you go halfway back on the previous stitch so that it's stitching over, which is why they call it an overstitch. And it basically approximates what a machine stitch will do. And actually, before there were sewing machines, this is the way people stitched their clothes so that they stayed together. And it's a pain in the butt if you have to do a whole long seam, but it's not a pain in the butt if you're just doing 1/4 inch. So that took not even a minute. And then what I'll do is I'll anchor, I'll go into my seam area, and I will anchor just a little bit. That's how I finish. Some people finish off with another knot. I prefer to just do 3 little stitches, cut it, trim my thread tails. Alright, mission accomplished. So, lesson learned, there's more than one way to skin a cat, as they say. Next time I show an invisible zipper, I will show it on a different fabric. So, there's one seam. That was the tough one. Now we're going to do just the regular seam. Alright, so I'm just doing a regular seam. Do a back stitch at the top to hold that in place. Now I don't like to use back stitches every single time I do a seam. I do it typically when I'm working the fabric, which means that there's going to be other stuff going on and I have to fit pieces together, and by doing that there's a possibility that that the stitches will open up a little bit. And also depending on the kind of fabric that I'm using. So fabric that has some texture or a slightly more open weave will pull the stitches open a little bit more readily than a tight fabric like a plain cotton or something. So this fabric is beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. It's either French or Italian, I forget which. But it has a relatively loose weave, which means I have to be careful about maintaining order, as it were. So back stitches are used with discretion. There we go. Now we have that seam. And so you can see everybody's lining up, even going across the sort of open chevron look. And this is happening. We're getting that chevron because we have the hip shape. All right. So next, I'm going to show you how to finish off these seams. Basically, because you don't want to have an unfinished seam. What I'm going to use is the Hug Snug seam tape, which is my absolute all-time favorite. And I'm going to show you what I do and how I do it. So we're going to step over to the ironing board. Okay, so I've just unraveled a whole bunch of seam tape. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to work my iron. So what I do is I take my tape, I fold it exactly in half so that one edge lines up perfectly with the other edge. I take my iron, I burn my fingers half the time, but you don't have to do that. I put it on a medium heat, not too hot, because seam tape is typically rayon, so you don't want to burn it. And I hold it taut. It's really easy to do. You just keep moving along, you hold it taut, you line up your edges, and you're making a fold. And we're going to fit this over those seam edges. And that's going to finish off our seam so beautifully. Now there are a couple of ways to actually do the seam edges. You can do each seam, or you can do the two seam pieces together. On this skirt, we're going to do the two seam pieces together, and I'll show you exactly what I mean when we get back to the sewing machine. But I'm doing a really long piece, mainly because we're going to use it not just on the two side seams, but on the facing and on the hem. So I'm going to just, while I'm here, do the whole thing. Okay, so we have our folded seam tape. I'm going to do this side, the zipper side, in two sections. What I did before, off camera, was where my notch was, I just snipped it almost to my side seam. And so I'm going to show you the closed version from that notch down, and then I'll show you the open version where we have our zipper. And we'll take it from there. So I just open this up and I slide the edge of my seam up to where the fold is. And just keep everything out of the way for now, right? Now, I'm using white tape and I've still got black thread in. No worries. Most of the time you want everything to match, but since this is a black and white skirt, I think I can get away with it. And hey, it might look kind of interesting. Actually, it'd probably look kind of weird, but we're doing this for demonstration purposes. So it actually is a good purpose. All right, so I've got this lined up. I stitch along the edge of my tape. And because I matched up my edges when I was folding it exactly in half, both edges are nicely clean. And we do this along the whole seam. Now, caveat, this is easier to do with thinner fabrics. It's not so easy to do on bulky fabrics, but I do it anyway. And sometimes on bulky fabrics, I do it the open seam way, which I will show you in a minute on the zipper part of the seam. All right, now, this is such a nice way, and I'm going to back stitch this because we're going to be working this hem. So I don't want that to come undone. Right, so as you see, that's nice and clean. It actually looks pretty good. I have one little wiggle here, but I'm not going to worry about that. So now what we do is, and this is, again, this is a little more difficult. I open my zipper to do this. It makes it just a little bit easier because you can maneuver a little bit better. So now what I do is I take it on each side, and this is what's called an open seam, whereas the other part was, when I sewed both edges together, that was a closed seam. So I'm going to do the same idea. I may have to adjust my needle because I'm working with different layers here, but let's see if this will work. Actually, I can see that my foot is going to be too far over, so I'm going to move my needle as far as I can and then line it up that way. Alternatively, you can put a regular zipper foot on and do it that way. So there's a couple of, as I said before, there's always another way to do it. Alright, so this should work out just fine. Yep, my foot clears the zipper. My needle's moved all the way to the left so that it's sewing right up against that far edge. And what I've got is a nice, beautiful, clean seam. Now, while I'm doing this, when you have curves, you want to have your curves as open as possible so that your seam tape doesn't pull. So you want your seam tape to be around the outside. You don't want it to tighten up, because then when you close up your skirt, the seam tape will actually pull it, and it will not be a pretty sight. So you always want to make sure that your seam tape allows you to be as flexible as possible when you're doing one of these kinds of seams. Now, some people say, oh, you know, you could just go and use a serger and serge everything beforehand and blah, blah, blah. And that's true, you can. You can do that. You can totally do that. I'm not going to do that, because it's not what I'm about. Okay, gotta get this guy out of the way. And gotta get this guy out of the way. But, plenty of people do it. I think it's kind of cheap looking, and that's why I like to use this tape. And this is more, and yes, this is a much more couture process. This is high fashion, high construction, whatever you want to call it. But it really, you know, it doesn't take that much more effort, and it's a much nicer, much more beautiful look. Now the nice thing about this seam tape is you are not obliged to turn under your raw edges. You can if you want to, you don't have to. So let's zip it up. So we've done one side, and we've done one side of an open seam, and we've done a whole closed seam. And there you go. That's the end of this lesson for today. See you next time when we do the facings.